When you're learning to paint portraits and figures, you end up having to represent a variety of textures and things in paint. Things like clothing, fabric, drapery, the wrinkles in cloth, and of course human skin, and solid substances like wood, in this case a violin. Flowers are another common subject in traditional painting, and they're a lot of fun to paint because of the bright, pretty colors. There's the occasional oddball object, such as this sewing machine that the little girl is sewing her doll clothing with. And I've painted my share of skulls over the years. Poor Ariadne here has to be careful where she steps with all these craniums scattered around, but she's more worried about where her boyfriend is anyway. Oh! Stop it, York. But one thing that you have to deal with on almost every figure, at least every portrait you paint, is hair. Most people have hair. Some people have a lot of hair. Other people, like me, are losing their hair. But hair is something you come across all the time. You'll have to learn to deal with. And since I'm painting a portrait right now, and I'm at the stage of doing the hair, I thought we could, in this session, talk about the painting of hair. Now, of course, there's no one right way to do hair. It's been done differently throughout the ages. In this painting, which was done, the original, over 3,500 years ago, the hair is painted as hardly more than a silhouette. And yet, if you look at some of the most famous portrait painters who ever lived, in this case John Sargent, he's almost gone back to a silhouette again, just like the painters of 3,000 years ago. Now, human hair comes in a great variety of colors, of course, but I have found that most of them can be represented by the earth colors, either pure or modified. The earth colors are raw umber, burnt umber, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and yellow ochre. Now, the earth colors have the advantage of being, first of all, inexpensive, but they're also very thick, dense, opaque colors, very quick drying colors, and easily adjusted to fit the situation as required. Now, for this particular portrait, the darkest of the earth colors seem to fit the bill best. So here is raw umber and burnt umber. And I'm going to label them right on the palette here with my felt-tipped pen so that I can remind myself which is which. And you really should do this with most of the colors on your palette, especially if you mix them. You can write what ingredients you used, and then later if you have to mix more, you know just how you did it. Now, I mentioned how thick these earth colors are. They are so stiff, in fact, that they are hard to brush. So the solution to that is to add some medium and thin them out a little bit, loosen them up. Any medium will do. There are many mediums. Use your favorite one. This particular medium here is something called Liquin. A roll of toilet paper, by the way, gives you an easy way to wipe off your palette knife between colors. Now, you only want to add enough of the medium to loosen the paint up and make it brushable. You want to leave it thick for painting hair, and I'll show you why in a minute. Now I'm going to squeeze out some white paint and use it to lighten up a little bit of each of these colors to make lighter versions of them. And this white happens to be flake white. In my DVDs on color, I discuss these different whites: flake white, zinc white, and titanium white, and what situations to use each one in to get the best results in a painting. Now, you see what I'm doing here is exactly what I did on my reference chart. I'm adding in some white to each of these colors to create a range of tones from very dark to very light. And with all these shades of these colors, I should be able to match anything that I see in the model's hair, or in the photograph in this case. And I want to show you how easy it is to adjust these colors. If I saw a bit of yellow in my model's hair, I could toss in a bit of any yellow ochre here. Or if I see red lights, Throw in any sort of red I see on the palette there. And now we're about ready to go. We'll pick a brush here. My preference is for a flat, square-cornered brush, and then I paint with the sharp edge of it, not with the flat part, just with the edge. The shape of the brush doesn't matter too much, but the stiffness of the brush does, because you have to push this thick paint around and the brush has to be stiff enough to do it. So whatever brush you settle on, it should be stiff enough to push around this thick paint, but still flex. In other words, not be so stiff that it scrapes the paint right back off the canvas again. You'll figure it out just by experimenting. Now I brought the hair in this portrait up to the point where you see it right now just by stroking it with the brush, doing exactly what you see me doing here. And the reason that I want such thick, heavy paint is that I'm trying to create ridges, streaks and ridges in the paint. And when they're dry, these grooves actually look like hair. They catch the light, especially when the varnish is on, and they look very hair-like, very realistic. You'll never see texture like this in a photograph or in a print. Only in a genuine oil painting, and people love to see it, so lay it on thick and get that texture. Now this method is called wet on wet. You've got a lot of wet paint up on the canvas now, and you're stroking more wet paint into it from the palette. And it's blending. Now you paint hair by combing it. Just stroke it with the brush, long, smooth strokes as if you are combing the hair. Now right there it's gotten a little bit too uniform, so I'm coming back in with the dark paint. Lots of dark paint. And using just the edge of the brush, I put some more dark back in. And now it seems a little bit too gray to me, and I can see in the model a little bit of color, so I'm going to loosen up a bit of this yellow ochre here with medium so it'll spread nicely, and I'm going to streak in a little bit of color so it's not quite so gray. And do it over here too to match. Look hard at your model or your photograph and you'll see these colors, whether they be yellowish, reddish, bluish, and put them in there. Now I'm using the dark paint to sort of open up the hair a little bit again. It got too blended. Now where you see the very lightest places on your model, you can use pure white paint like this. It's not going to stay pure white as you blend it in with this wet on wet technique. It'll blend right in with the rest of the paint, but it will be lighter. Let me go back to the palette here and get some of this dark color and cut back into this area that I lightened up and open it up a bit. What you're not seeing here is that I'm wiping the brush on a rag before each trip back to the palette. When you're painting wet into wet like this, the brush always picks up a little paint off of the canvas, and you need to wipe the brush clean before you go back to the palette for fresh paint. Now let me pick up some of this thick, creamy burnt umber here and stroke it into the little girl's hair. And once again, by using this thick, heavy paint, I'm creating lines and grooves and ridges that will eventually pick up the light and look very much like real hair. Which is why you stroke the hair as though you're combing it. And after a little while, you almost feel like you're combing real hair. Now, the more you stroke it, the more it's going to blend, so you can overdo it. And actually, you very often do overdo it and have to go back and, in some cases, lighten it back up or darken it back down in areas. In places where it's become too uniform by overblending. And again, at all times, you're looking at your model or your reference photograph to determine where to put the lightest tones and where to make it the darkest. And as with all paintings, you want to occasionally just set the brush down and go away, get a cup of coffee, or set it aside and take it up the next day. That way, when you come back, you're looking at it with a fresh eye, and you can see things that you didn't see before. And here again, where you really want to lighten up some parts of the hair, you may want to go get some pure white and stroke that in. because it will blend with the paint that's already there and will lighten the hair right up. And as you're making these brush strokes, it's best if the brush is moving before it touches the canvas, and then lift it away before the stroke is over. And that way the streak of paint comes to a point at each end. And here again, where the white paint or the light colored paint makes things look a little bit too gray, you want to come back in with little touches of color. A little bit of reddishness, a little bit of yellow, maybe some blue. Any colors that you see in the real hair, they are there. They're subtle in many cases, but they are there. And bringing those colors back in makes the hair look more interesting and more realistic. Now, there are some cases where your model's hair, or skin for that matter, is in very strong bright light that you may have very strong highlights. Now, this is not one of those cases, but in a case where you do see very bright highlights and you try to get those highlights by blending in lighter colored paint, it may not work because of the blending. So in that case, you may want to let the painting dry overnight or for a day or two, and then put the strong highlights in with light paint that does not blend, because you're putting wet on dry in that case. It all depends on the situation, and it all comes from experience. I'm just letting you know that there are cases where you may have to let the paint dry to put on the brightest highlights later. Let me stroke in some highlights here. And this is about as bright as they're going to get, going wet into wet. Zip, that's kind of fun. But that's okay, because that's what I'm seeing in my photograph. This is as light as the highlights get. Wipe the brush on a rag, and now I go back for some of the darkest paint and lay it right beside the light paint for contrast. Light against dark. It's contrast that makes paintings interesting. Light against dark, warm colors against cool colors, long sweeping brush strokes against short fussy ones. Contrasts, the key to beautiful and interesting paintings. Okay, well, I think that's enough on this one for now. I'll just let it sit for a day or two and look at it again and see if I think it needs some more. Undoubtedly it will. And I can hear you thinking, you're saying, okay, Tom, this is pretty easy. This is nice straight hair. What about curly hair? Surely that's a lot harder. Well, actually it's not, and I'll show you in a minute. All right, here's a painting with curly hair. This little girl has lovely blondish, reddish, auburn hair, and obviously we're going to have to use a little different technique. We're going to have to swirl the paint in. Once again, I'm picking a square-cornered brush, and I'll just be painting with the edge of it. But this is a smaller brush than before because this is a smaller head with smaller details. All right, now back to my chart of the earth colors. Yellow ochre is the closest thing I've got here, but it's kind of dull. So I'll brighten the yellow ochre up a bit with this lemon yellow, and that'll raise the value up close to what I see on the painting. But the little girl has a sort of a reddish tinge to her hair. It's kind of auburn, so I'll add in just a bit of red to do that. Any red would do, but this transparent iron oxide red seems to work well. And there we are, we're getting pretty close. Now as for the darkest color, I'm just going to use one of my other earth colors, raw umber or burnt umber. And now I've got the light, medium, and dark that I need for hair. Now how did I know how to mix this color? Well, I just looked up on my color charts. These are the charts that I show you how to make in my color DVD that you can get off my website. In this case, there's the yellow ochre chart, and I zero right in on the color that I'm after. This is the color that's on the original painting that I'm making a copy of here, William Bouguereau's Storybook. These charts, by the way, are awfully hard to get along without, unless you're willing to mix up colors by trial and error, which usually results in mountains of wasted paint. But with these charts, you can always find the color that you're looking for on your model, usually nearly exactly, and you can see just how to mix them. Now obviously with this curly hair we can't make those long straight strokes we were doing with the last painting. We have to make little circular motions, flick like that. And again, you want the brush to be moving before it touches the canvas and still moving when you lift it off. And make your curls in any direction that you have to reproduce what you see on your model or in the painting that you're copying, like this. And again, you want to wipe your brush off before each trip back to the palette for fresh paint. Now on this painting, we're making a great effort to reproduce individual little curls and even individual hairs. So I've picked here a very small pointed brush to do that with. And with this little pointy brush, I can make very small curls. And by just very lightly contacting the canvas, I can even attempt to represent individual hairs, like this. And now this hair is starting to look so soft and fluffy that you almost want to pet it with your hand. Now to get the dark tones in the hair, we go to our darkest paint, which is this umber, and just stroke it in and blend it with the paint that's already there. And blend until you get just the tone that you want. If necessary, going back for a little more light or a little more dark paint until you're satisfied with it. So that's how to paint curly hair. And it wasn't so hard, was it? Now there are situations where you run into hairs that's so dark that you have no midtones at all. Well, you'll still have these highlights. All hair has a natural sheen, so you'll have these highlights like this. So even though you don't put in any midtones, or very few, you can put in those highlights. Now this painting dried on me overnight, so I'm putting wet on dry, and it's not blending in. And I mentioned before that this is a technique you can use to put in very high highlights, putting wet on dry, if you need highlights that high. In this case, I don't, so I'm going to go get the dark paint and wet it again and blend it in. And by the way, I'm using the same brush for the light and the dark paint. Some artists will use one brush for light and one brush for dark, but I just thoroughly wipe the brush before going back to the palette, no matter which color I'm going for. And you're blending anyway, so I find that one brush can do for both. And as usual, I fiddle and fuss back and forth until I get things just the way I want them. Now this is how it came out in the finished painting. And you can see that without that highlight, these heads would not look nearly so round and three-dimensional as they do. And by the way, also notice how the grooves made by the brush in this very thick paint catch the light and make the hair look very realistic. Now on this portrait, I've painted in the darker tones to get started, and I did it yesterday. It's already dried, and you can see the grooves in the paint that have dried and are already picking up the light. And the same to a lesser extent over here, and there'll be a lot more of that as I continue to paint with this very thick paint. Now I'm going back to my earth color chart here to pick the lighter hair color that I want. Those are too dark. That's too yellowish. This is definitely too yellow, and that's too red. So none of these earth colors in their pure form are what I'm looking for. So once again, I go back up on the wall to my color charts to find the one I want. And looking at the chart of yellow ochre color combinations, it appears that the one I have in mind is way off there in the lower right corner, which is yellow ochre mixed with burnt sienna. So there's the yellow ochre, there's the burnt sienna. Always a good idea to label them on the glass palette. Here is the two mixed together now, and it looks just a little bit too red to me, so I think I will put in a little bit of burnt umber to dull it down. And now it's become just a tad too dark. So I'll go get some of my flake white again and lighten it up just a little. And there is the color that I have in mind right there. And I can use the pure burnt umber for the dark tones and mix a little bit of white with the mid-tones to get the light hair tones. And now I have the dark, mid-tones, and light. All the hair colors I need for this particular portrait. Now I'll add some thinner to these mixtures because this paint is so thick it will be hard to spread with a brush. But with more medium in it, it will loosen up. And you just have to remember not to put too much. You don't want to make it watery. You want to still be able to spread it, and you want it to be thick so that it will form those grooves and lines that you want on the canvas. And there it is, thin enough to brush, yet still thick enough to create texture. Now I'll choose a brush, and as usual I'll pick my favorite type for hair, which is a square-cornered brush that is stiff enough to push this thick paint. And just like before, I'll use the corner or the edge of it to paint thin lines of hair, and anywhere I want to paint broadly, I'll use the flat part. Okay, so let's get going, and once again, this is the wet into wet technique where I blend the light, medium, and dark tones wet on the canvas. And using a lot of paint, I'm using the flat part of the brush to roll the paint into these great big curls here, this 1950s hairstyle. And on the side here, I kind of have to imagine how these curls went because I'm handicapped by having as my model a 55-year-old photograph of my mother. And being black and white and rather fuzzy, it doesn't really show me how these curls went. So I'm kind of working from memory like I am on the color. I remember her hair being that color. Now I'm going to pick up some of the lighter stuff after wiping my brush on the rag as usual and put this lighter tone wherever I see it. I can barely see it in this old photograph. And now I'll wipe the brush again and go back for the dark tones. And I'll put the darkest color under the curls where I imagine there was shadow. And I'll keep it up with this light, medium, and dark brown until I think it looks convincingly like hair. Now I wipe my brush off again and go get some of the pure white and put a line of pure white along the edge of the curl here. If you look at the little photo, you can see that line of sheen running along the side of the curl there. And so I continue blending wet into wet with the light, medium, and dark tones until it looks right to me. Now I think this is coming along all right. Today Mom's hair is all white. The brown is gone. But at least she has hair. Mine's disappearing. But I think Mom will recognize herself, and she probably won't be too hard on me. She knows this painting was done with a lot of love. And speaking of paintings that have a lot of love mixed into the paint, here is a painting of my beautiful daughter, Mary. And at this stage, I've just about got it finished. I'm just stroking in some of the darker tones here. But I don't have to explain it by now. You've heard this before. And this hair is sort of a combination of straight and curly. And I think it's coming along all right too. Okay, so that's how you paint hair. At least that's how I paint hair, and I hope that's been helpful to you. The other thing you want to do as you learn to paint hair, because you're going to be developing your own style, you look in your art books, where you can see examples of how other artists did things. And you can also make copies of the better illustrations, as I have done here with my my copy of Sargent's Lady Agnew. Now I keep telling you that you need to collect these big coffee table books on art, and you can get them in the used bookstores because people get them as Christmas presents and then they discard them, and you can find them in the bookstores. And looking at these will give you other ideas how hair is painted or how other painters have painted hair in the past. Renoir, for example, did not go into a great deal of detail on the hair he painted. Everybody does it differently, and as I say, there is no one way to do it. There are many ways to do it, and you will develop your own style. Whether it be minimal or horribly obsessive or somewhere in between. But that still doesn't solve my problem. The older I get, the less hair I've got. It won't be too many years before I look just like Bertha over there. Now her problem is easily solved because all I have to do is throw a wig on her and she looks fine. But the same thing doesn't work so well for me. I mean, it just doesn't cut it. But maybe if I just take some of this earth color, since it's worked so well on the paintings, and see if it works on me.